You're listening to Monday Matters, a Principal Matters podcast production.
Hi, friends. This is Will Parker, host of Principal Matters, the School Leaders Podcast, back with my co-host, Dr. Jen Schwanke, for a Monday Matters episode. Jen, it's May, and it's so great to sit in a room with you. We're going to be talking a little bit today about the value of consistency, something that from my newest book. But before we do that, I just wanted to say, first of all, I'm so grateful to have you as a co-host on this podcast. And I'm grateful that you're recovering well because you recently had some time in the hospital. So we were going to bring one of those stories into today's conversation. So why don't we start there, if you don't mind?
Right. I was so inspired by this moment. I had to have a procedure done. I was dreading it, really anxious. The procedure happened. It was very painful. And, staying in a hospital for a few nights is just awful because you get woken up every hour or two. Well, I had a nurse, and her name was Grace, and she did some really incredible work, not only to keep me out of pain, but she told me her story at 2:30 in the morning, and her story really moved me. She was a nurse in Kenya with her husband, and she heard about a program. She said, there's such a shortage of nurses that recruiters would come to the hospital where she was working, and they would say, come to America, we'll sponsor you and you can come be a nurse in America. And she said, it was really hard for her and her husband to make that decision. They had 2 children. It was going to be a huge life change. She was going to leave her mother. She was going to leave her siblings. And they decided, this is a chance. This is a dream. Let's go do this. And so they applied and they came and they landed in Ohio, and they knew no one. They had no idea how to proceed. And then she found out she was pregnant. And she said it was a terribly, terribly low time in her life. But then she said, we found the school. We found that the bus would come and take our children to school. They love their teachers. Things started to kind of fall into place. And she said we had this incredible social worker who helped us navigate all the complexities of being in a new country. All of that is inspiring in itself. But then I said, well, what about the nursing part? And she said, Jen, in Kenya, nurses do not make much money. The only reason you go into nursing is because you love it, because it's a calling. That's the only reason. And she said, now we're doing okay. She said, we still live in a very small apartment. Life is still very hard, but, we feel like we're paid what we're worth. But we are nurses. She and her husband are both nurses. We are nurses because we believe in caring for people. And I thought about that, 2:30, 3:30, 4:30, 5:30 in the morning because of its direct tie to education and how caring for others is such a deep calling. I don't think any of us went into it thinking, well, this is going to get me a yacht. It's just not that job. And the connection I want to make to your book, to the chapter we're discussing today about the value of consistency, is outcomes. Mm-hmm. You say in your book, whether a person is achieving outcomes is not nearly as important as whether those outcomes are meaningful ones. Wow. And I thought about Nurse Grace and, how she was caring for somebody in the dark of the night, and she was so committed to it. That was what she was called to do.
Yeah, I'm so glad you started with that story, Jen. That's so heartwarming, and that is such a great way to bring it full circle, because you're right. I referenced this book in the chapter that a lot of us have heard about, but I think the applications we made from this book may have been incorrect. But, when Malcolm Gladwell wrote his book, The Outliers, The Stories of Success, he made famous this idea that committing 10,000 hours to practicing a craft means you master it. And since then, Gladwell himself has come out to say, I don't think people have either, I didn't explain it correctly or people are misinterpreting it. It's when you commit 10,000 hours to the right practices that you create really positive outcomes. You can commit 10,000 hours to doing something really horribly and become a master at doing things horribly. Right. Or you can commit 10,000 hours to doing something that's meaningful and do it really well, and that you become a master at that craft. And so one of the things that I talk about in this book is something that's really simple, but as simple as it is, I don't know why it's so hard for us to do it, Jen, but that is just when you know that there's something that you want to accomplish that's meaningful, Giving yourself permission, and you notice that theme over and over. Whose permission are you waiting for? Giving yourself permission to intentionally engage in the thing that you know is going to create a best outcome for you.
Hmm.
I mean, we can apply this in a gazillion ways. We can talk about our own personal health. When we commit to movement and good nutrition and rest, there's going to be a really good outcome that comes normally. You can't control when you're going to be hospitalized, when you're not, but you can control factors that mitigate some of the more difficult outcomes that come from that too. Go ahead.
Right. Sorry. For listeners, my face contorts when I have something to say. The other thing that we can control is look for the learning in all of it.
Mhm.
At in that hospital bed in the middle of the night, I didn't think I'd be so moved and so grounded by someone else's story. There was a lot of learning in that for me, and a lot of gratitude and perspective too, right? And so, look for what that moment is meant to give you, whether you're disciplining a student, whether you're speaking to a parent, whether you're, um, you know, building your master schedule. What is this moment? What does it mean for you? And how does it tie back to your calling?
I agree. And there's this, I think there's two things sometimes going on in play here when it comes to consistency. One is, am I willing to commit to the habits necessary to grow that area where I want to grow? But the other is, am I consistently committing to something that's meaningful enough that I want to have the outcome that's going to grow me in that direction too? And I think one of the examples I give in the book was when I started creating the content for Principal Matters. It was more than 10 years ago now, Jen, when I decided one night I was camping with Jack. I had taken a book with me by Michael Hyatt on the camp out, and I was reading while he was asleep. And Michael Hyatt had been he's the former CEO of Thomas Nelson Publishing. He was a very famous blogger and eventually a leadership consultant. And he was talking about how he had seen content creators, how many of them he had seen over time just give up.
Hmm.
And he said a lot of times people will commit to doing something for a year or maybe 2 years or maybe 3 years. But he said 5 years is usually the commitment where you begin to see that skill turn into a craft. Again, that whole 10,000 hours of committed to the right kind of skills and development. And so for whatever reason, I can still remember exactly where we were. In that tent, I said, I want to create content, but I want to do it meaningfully. And I'm going to right now making a commitment. I'm going to create some piece of content and I'm going to share something out once a week for the next 5 years.
Hmm.
And
That's
I did,
big.
and
It's a
and
big
I,
deal.
yeah, and except for an occasional Christmas holiday, it happened every
Mhm.
single week for 5 years. And it's so weird, Jen, because even when I started this business full time a couple of years ago, people would sometimes friends might say to me, "Wow, Will, how were you able to so quickly move from what you did as a full time job to this?" And I was like, "Well, actually, it took me 10 years.
Right,
It
exactly.
took me 10 years."
I tell people that all the time because they ask me about this podcast. And I say, you guys don't, you have to understand the perseverance and the will and the commitment that it took. I said, I got to ride on Will's coattails these last couple of years, but you were dogged. You were not going to stop. And I agree. I think it's about perseverance and about honoring that commitment. I know probably, a handful of people who have started a podcast and it's no longer active because it is a massive amount of work to constantly be thinking about your next guest, when you're going to record, to schedule. I mean, my goodness, even when I do recordings, just finding a time that works for everyone can be a morning. So it's that consistency, it's that commitment, it's promising yourself that you're going to do it.
Yeah. And then it's also just the permission to take a step back. And I like to ask myself this question: if I've set a goal that's meaningful, I like to reflect at the end of a day and just say, okay, how did I move the needle toward that goal? And maybe you didn't. And sometimes you got to give yourself grace. Or maybe there's just one little thing you could do that could move the needle before you finish the day, and you could do that.
Right.
And so as we wrap up, I'm going to read a few things that I wrote in this chapter because and I'm just going to read myself, but I said the same concept applies to your growth as an educator and a human being. If you realize you need to move the needle in your goals and growth, you might decide to take a few minutes to do so in the following ways. So here's some things to think about: calling a friend to touch base and ask about an area they're celebrating or finding challenging, listening to a podcast on your commute home or while making dinner that motivates you to grow as a leader, listening to an audiobook that inspires or challenges you in your thinking, texting a few friends to remind them that they're important to you and you wish them well, saying a prayer for someone you're concerned about, or asking for wisdom or perspective on whatever challenge you're facing. So I won't read them all, Jen, but just I think every single day we can be making some movement towards the outcome and the meaning that we want to experience, even if it's just a little thing. It can grow over time.
I love it. I love it. And I think, sometimes that self-reflection can feel inauthentic, but how did I do today? But I think it's the way that the needle moves is if you're checking in on yourself honestly and consistently and giving yourself permission, as you said.
Yeah. And man, reflection, that's a whole nother topic. We'll talk about that later, but just the power of just taking the time to reflect gives you that perspective to move forward to. So Principle Matters listeners, as you step into your week, wherever you are, maybe some of you are wrapping up your semester, maybe some of you are getting ready for your last month, maybe some of you on the other side of the globe in Australia, you're like, oh, you guys are talking about ending school and we're at the beginning of our year. Wherever you are, just remember that what you do is so important. And thank you for listening, because what you do matters. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Principle Matters, the School Leaders Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, would you take a moment and like, share, subscribe, or leave us a review? In fact, if you share it out with a friend, even more people can become a part of these conversations. Sign up for our newsletter at williamdparker.com for even more free resources. And don't forget to check out our website to learn more about our books, professional development offerings, Grow Academies, masterminds, executive coaching, and keynote presentations. Wow, let's keep learning together. And thank you for doing what matters.
Monday Matters.